Welcome to Save the Nation on ADH TV. I'm David Flint, and we have three interesting guests today. Leith van Onselen speaking on problems economic, Dr. David Adler of the Australian Jewish Association, who will be speaking on the situation in the Middle East and the attack on the synagogue in Melbourne, as well as Greg Copley, who will be speaking on the reintegration of Canada into the Five Eyes Agreement, as well as the impact in the Middle East of the election of Donald Trump. I think this will be an interesting number of interviews, and welcome again to this, the final episode of Save the Nation for this year. When President Biden was saying he would never pardon Hunter, Senator Ted Cruz and Mark Levine were predicting he would do exactly that. The media has pretended surprise at the pardon, but then joined in suggestions about who else is up to their necks in crime and who should therefore also be pardoned in what will be, if it goes ahead, one of the biggest abuses of power, at least of the pardoning power, ever seen in the United States. When the Founding Fathers took the concept of pardoning from the royal prerogative of mercy, there were suggestions in the debates that any such pardon should be subject to congressional approval. That was rejected. This pardon, the pardon to Hunter Biden, is a pardon not just to Biden, not just to Hunter Biden, but it's to what author Peter Schweitzer, president of the Government Accountability Institute, calls the Biden crime family. Joe Biden took advantage of his own son's addiction to use him as the bagman to collect illicit funds, selling access and influence to Chinese Communist Party billionaires and corrupt figures in various criminal regimes around the world. Biden didn't make his millions, nor did his family, from his salary. All the media knew this. The obvious fact is Trump is unique and has the capacity to save America and save the West. That's what they're trying to stop. Well, once again, I'm delighted to have with us the unconventional economist, Leith van Onselen. Welcome, Leith.
G'day, David. Thanks for having me on again.
A pleasure, always a pleasure. Leith, a few weeks ago, Rowan Dean, the editor of Spectator, referred to me as the much-loved columnist on Spectator Australia, and he said, to quote him, I'm often referring to my fear that we're hurtling down the same path established by Venezuela and especially Argentina. That is a rich country becoming poor, a country full of resources but becoming poor. And I had a little table which we're putting up on the screen now, in which I just wanted to show the difference in the GDPs of various countries. And we have the situation in 1980 when our GDP per capita in Australia was 11,000 and that in Singapore 5,000, and then the estimated ones for 2029, Australia at 75,000, it'll probably be less than that with the way the government's going, and Singapore 109,000 and America 102,000. These are the GDPs per capita. Extraordinary, isn't it, that such a country brimming with the wealth of all of our resources seems to be really going backwards. And this is something I think you've talked about very well. What's your view on this? How do you explain this?
Yeah, so look, I've said it previously, Australia should be the richest country on earth. So we have literally everything the world needs bar oil. So we are swimming in coal, iron ore, natural gas, lithium, nickel, uranium, etc. We are top three, country in the world for all those sorts of things. We're number one for iron ore and coal, and we're number one or two for natural gas and all these other areas. So we have everything the world needs, and we should be the richest country on earth because of that. But instead, we sell all this stuff far too cheaply overseas. We have hollowed out our manufacturing base in Australia. So in the 1970s, manufacturing made up about 25% of the Australian economy. We've now got the lowest manufacturing share in the advanced world, in the OECD, at about 5%. So we've basically deindustrialised Australia's economy, and we've done that through a number of channels. So firstly, we had the mining boom, obviously in the early 2000s, which ran for a decade or so. That pushed up the Australian dollar. It made us less competitive, and then that led to contraction in manufacturing. So we lost the car industry and a whole bunch of other things. Since then, we've also we've given ourselves some of the most expensive energy prices domestically in the world. So we used to pay, one of the world's lowest rates for electricity and gas, which gave us a competitive advantage against other countries. Now, because of this, our failures to reserve our gas, open up the export terminals on the East Coast, which has pushed up the price, creating artificial shortages, as well as this net zero delusion, whereby suddenly it's evil to burn anything that's a hydrocarbon. We've shut down our reliable coal-fired, baseload energy, shifted towards unreliable renewables. And all we've effectively done is we've made our cost base incredibly high. It's led to more manufacturing closing. And what's happened is Australia's manufacturing is effectively shut down. It's then shifted to China, who we sell all these goods to too cheaply. So we're effectively selling our energy to China on the cheap so that China can build up its manufacturing output. And so then it can resell things like solar panels and wind turbines and everything back to us, which then we subsidise. So it's all back to front. And, as a result, and obviously China's carbon emissions are then rising exponentially, and China's accounted for about 2/3 of the world's increase in carbon emissions this century, while us and other developed countries are deindustrialising all for the sake of net zero. It doesn't make any sense. And the thing that I'm worried about here, David, is that because our economy has been hollowed out and it's become solely reliant on importing masses of people, as well as, obviously now government spending, we are going down the Argentinian route, whereby we are stuck with chronically low productivity. So some data's come out recently, and it shows that Australia's, in the national accounts, it shows that Australia's productivity growth has collapsed to 2016 levels. We've now experienced the biggest productivity decline out of advanced countries in the last decade or so. And we are basically becoming a low productivity, very unsophisticated economy. And as a result, we've had a per capita recession for 7 consecutive quarters. Our real per capita household disposable income's fallen by 8.4% since this government came to office. And we've got an economy that's effectively that's growing incredibly slowly. It's growing through population growth and through other unsustainable means. It's got decrepit productivity, and our living standards are going backwards. And I think if we keep going down this road, we're going to end up falling down the developed country rankings. And if you play this out for long enough, we could end up being like an Argentina. And the Harvard Business School does an economic complexity study every 2 years. And what it showed is that this century, Australia's economic complexity ranking out of about 150 countries has fallen from about 60 in the world at the start of the century to about 102 in the world. And we're now behind Bangladesh and Senegal, where we are literally, we are ranked alongside African nations for economic complexity. And this is because we have deindustrialised and we've just become basically a people servicing economy. We import heaps of people, and then we just, provide low productivity services to them and build houses for them. That's effectively the Australian economy now. And it's, it didn't have to be this way. But unfortunately, that's what we've got. And we still aren't capturing nearly enough revenue from our resource exports. We're not value adding to our resource base to try and actually add value to it and go up the value chain. We've just become like an African nation, unfortunately.
And the importing of people, will that change if the government changes?
I very much doubt it, unfortunately. So we actually got some new population data that came out from the September quarter national accounts last week, and it was quite bizarre. So what you can do is, and what I've done, I should say, is if you divide the aggregate GDP of Australia, so the total GDP, by GDP per capita, which the ABS provides, you can get a population estimate. And it's basically the ABS's population estimate up to the September quarter, because the official population data is only up to the March quarter. So it's running about 6 months behind. But what it showed is that the national account showed that our population grew by 168,000 people in the year to September, which is an extraordinary number. And over the year, in the September quarter, I should say, it grew by 168,000 in just one quarter. And in the year to September, Australia's population grew by 638,400 in 1 year. Now, just to put that into perspective, that is the equivalent of growing by a Hobart plus a Darwin in a single year. And yes, it has fallen a little bit. So our population growth peaked at about 660,000, but it's only come down to around 640,000. So we've gone from Mount Everest down to K2. We're still growing incredibly strongly. And the unfortunate thing that's happened this week is that, or over the weekend, was that, the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, basically wouldn't commit to lowering immigration. He said that he'll explain how the coalition will lower immigration and by how much after the next federal election. So he's basically walked back his commitment to cutting net overseas migration. And this comes from the back of, the coalition obviously voting against Labor's international student caps as well and blocking that a couple of weeks back. So, this is what I always feared. All sides of politics are card-carrying members of Big Australia. They all support high immigration. It's just a matter of degrees by which they support it. So, leading up to the pandemic, the previous government ran a mass immigration program. The previous government before that, the Rudd-Gillard government ran a mass immigration program. John Howard started the mass immigration program in about the mid-2000s. And it seems that if the coalition get elected, they're going to continue it. They'll just cut it back a little bit. But we're still going to have this absurd high immigration that we've run for 20 years. And it has wrecked Australia's living standards. We've had chronic shortages in housing infrastructure. It's wrecked productivity because the population has grown faster than we could build infrastructure, we could provide business investment, or we could provide housing. And it's led to what I explained previously as capital shallowing, which happens when you get less capital per worker. And a very basic stylized example of that is which I've used previously, is that if you run a cafe and you have 2 employees working one coffee machine and you can produce 50 coffees per hour, if you double the number of staff working that one coffee machine, you won't get double the amount of coffees made per hour, because those staff will have to wait for each other to make coffee. They'll bump into each other. There'll be congestion around the machine, etc. So instead of making 100 coffees per hour with 4 staff, you might make 75. So your output doesn't match the inputs in labour. And that is effectively what has happened with the Australian economy over the last 20 years. We've grown this century. We've grown the population by 8.5 million people, but we haven't provided the business investment to go with it, the infrastructure or the housing. And what it's meant is that the economy overall has become less productive because our workers have had less capital to play with. And that is one of the drivers of Australia's productivity collapse. It's not the only driver, but it's a significant one. And unfortunately, Peter Dutton has suggested that the coalition is going to keep the throttle on immigration. It's just going to pull back a little bit from the previous government. So really, we need a complete reset in this country, and I just can't see the new, changing government necessarily providing that. It might just, smooth it around the margins.
So what the leader of the opposition has said, you will learn about what we're going to do about population after I'm elected as Prime Minister.
Yeah, it's crazy. Why can't he come out before the election and actually tell us what he's going to do? And look, he doesn't have to look too far, because even in Canada, so Canada's run an even more absurd immigration program the last couple of years under Justin Trudeau. So they had a 1.2 million increase in their population. This is on a country of about 40 million people in 1 year. So our population went up 660 at the peak. Theirs went up by 1.2 million on a population of 40 million versus 27. Now, what their government's done, it's been so unpopular over there, and it's wrecked the housing market. They've got huge problems there from importing so many people so quickly, that the Trudeau government has committed to freezing immigration, so zero net overseas migration for 3 years, to allow infrastructure and housing to catch up. And Peter Dunn should simply copy that sort of approach. He should say, we're going to freeze immigration for a few years, or if not freeze it, cut it back drastically. So cut it back severely, to under 100,000 a year, from about 400 to 500 currently. And, it would be popular in the electorate, because Australians don't support this huge immigration. We've seen the problems. Our living standards are going backwards. We've got a, chronic, absolutely absurd housing crisis, both if you're trying to rent or buy. We've got a future whereby the governments are trying to shoebox future residents into high-rise dog box apartments. Australians don't want this. And all it needs is for, all it needs is for Peter Dutton to, grasp onto this and give us what we want. But unfortunately, he's so wedded to the property lobby, his big business mates, etc., the universities who are, screaming blue murder about it, that he seems to not actually want to cut immigration, or, only cut it a tiny bit.
The Americans seem to have an even bigger problem, didn't they, with the open borders? But they've got a president who's come in very strongly saying, well, this is going to stop under me and I'm going to reverse it. Do you think Trump's example will spill over in relation to the other Western countries?
Well, I hope so, but we have to see with Trump, because Trump's also promised to hand out green cards to anybody who's an international student. So he came out... So he actually said, if you have a student visa and you study at one of our institutions, we'll give you a green card automatically, which is absurd policy. But whether he follows through, that was just a sort of brain fart. He gave in an interview a few months back. But so we'll have to wait and see. But look, Australia's got a natural advantage. We don't have a joint border with anybody, right? So anybody who comes here has to come by plane or by boat. So it actually is pretty easy for Australia to stop immigration if we want to. It's not that hard. Americans don't have that luxury. They've got obviously a southern border and a northern border where people can literally cross the land. So we should be able to control our immigration a lot easier than the United States can. But our federal government for 20 years has instead, imported massive amounts of people by plane. And, Then at the same time, they try and gaslight us that the housing crisis is caused by other factors. It's not, because 100% of Australia's population growth is coming from net overseas migration, because they either come here directly by plane, or when migrants have children, that's then counted as natural increase. If we didn't have immigration, we wouldn't have any population growth, and therefore we wouldn't need to build any houses other than just rebuilding old houses that are old and need to be replaced. So Australia's housing crisis is an immigration crisis. It's as simple as that. So anybody who claims that the housing shortage has nothing to do with immigration is literally deluded, because all of Australia's future population growth, as projected by the ABS and the Intergeneration Report, is going to come from net overseas migration, both as migrants arrive by plane and then once migrants have children. That is the only thing that's going to grow the population.
The fundamental problem seems to be the quality of governance then.
Oh, yeah. Look, unfortunately, we are one of the worst government countries in the world. So as I said, we have all the natural advantages that other countries would die for. We're abundant resources in everything other than oil. And yet we have somehow engineered a cost of living crisis, an energy crisis, a budget crisis. We never seem to have enough revenue, an inflation crisis, and everything crisis. Let's be quite honest, a population crisis. This has all been generated by failed government policy. They could easily have taken a different approach. For example, copy Norway or even Qatar, which basically tax their resources properly. They don't run an absurd immigration program to dilute their mineral wealth, which is what we do. And, I've said it before, David, Norwegians are sitting on a sovereign wealth fund via taxing their resources properly. That's worth currently about $310,000 US per citizen. So, when you have a sovereign wealth fund that is worth $310,000 US per citizen, you have a direct incentive not to run a high immigration program. Because if you import people, you dilute your sovereign wealth fund amongst more people and you become poorer. Australia, we don't tax our mineral resources properly. We have no sovereign wealth fund from our sources to show for it. We are chronically, underfunded from a budgetary perspective. And the federal government's brainiac solution is just to import more people so we've got more PAYE taxpayers. When really we should be importing less people and taxing our resources properly, and then we could just share in the wealth. So we don't do anything properly here.
One of the things which ensures that we continue to have career politicians on both sides is probably the way in which the two-party system has been built in. And once they've got in, they've taken measures to ensure that the two-party system continues. For example, preferential voting helps, I think, the two-party system. And compulsory voting probably also helps that too. Most countries don't have that. Most countries also have much better identification requirements when voting. All of these seem to be things which the major parties seem to agree on.
Yeah, and it's basically just to keep the duopoly, isn't it?
Yes.
Of the two parties. And, look, David, I'm often asked, often people say, Leith, why don't you get into politics? Well, I'll tell you why I don't get into politics. Because, well, firstly, I think I could have more impact on the sidelines writing about it and doing these sorts of interviews. But secondly, it's because of the two-party system, because the only way I could ever actually get into politics is I'd have to join one of the major parties, and then you have to vote along party lines. And the fact of the matter is I disagree with the major parties on most policies. So someone like me, if I joined the Liberal Party, I'd end up just having to do press conferences where I'd have to spout the party line against my will. And because that's what's been decided at the high level, in caucus or whatever. So that's why I've never joined politics, because you can't under the two-party system. And the only way you're going to get elected under the two-party system is to join one of the two parties. So we're in a bit of a catch-22 here where we can't get alternative ideas in and contestable ideas because you can't enter the system in the first place unless you join one of the two parties. And then once you do it, you have to toe the party line.
Yes, and even there, when it comes to the two parties, there's then a desperate attempt by the party hierarchy to control the pre-selection system so that you only pre-select people who will toe the party line. And the tendency is quite often, not always, but quite often is to bring in people they're already part of the party circle before they are pre-selected. They're working for politicians and so on. So you create a system where they're repeating themselves, getting the same sort of people into politics. This is a sad situation, isn't it, for a country which has such wealth?
Yeah, it is. And unfortunately, it just seems to be, we're in sort of terminal decline in Australia. As I said, we have deindustrialised. We've destroyed our manufacturing base. We have the lowest, manufacturing share in the OECD. We have one of the least complex economies in the world. We are literally ranked alongside a whole host of, two-bit African nations for economic complexity. And there is no will politically to turn things around. And instead we get gimmicks like, Albanese's Future Made in Australia program, whereby he basically wants to throw billions of dollars of our taxpayers' money at hand-picked industries to be manufacturing so-called superpowers. So he wants us to build solar panels and, wind turbines and all this sort of stuff. But these are things that we'll never be competitive in, and we'll only be able to build them on the back of the taxpayer subsidies. When really the solution is to fix the gas market, deliver us cheap gas and electricity prices, and make it so that we can build stuff ourselves in Australia because we have lower cost energy than most places in the world. That would actually give us a manufacturing base, and then but unfortunately there's no will to change these things.
Leith, once again, you've explained the situation, and it is a rather sad picture that is now going down the Argentinian path. I do recommend to viewers that they go back and look again, watch again, how well you explained why we were having blackouts in New South Wales. You explained that superbly, and you go right back to the beginning, the privatisation of energy in New South Wales. Thank you again, Leith, and thank you for your contribution this year. I hope that you will be available next year when we start the programs again in January, because what you give us with your unconventional economics is the truth of the matter in relation to the fundamental changes which we must make if Australia is to go down the right path. Thank you, Leith, and Merry Christmas.
Yeah. You too, David. I'll speak to you next year.
Certainly. Thank you. Well, I'm delighted that our next guest is a favourite of this program, favourite of viewers, certainly, of this program, Gregory Copley, who's the president of the Washington-based International Strategic Studies Association and an advisor to a number of governments and world leaders on international affairs. And given the situation, welcome, certainly. Welcome, Greg.
Wonderful to be with you, David.
Thank you. What is attracting everybody's attention at the time that this program is being put together is the fall of the Assad government, particularly in the light of a completely new administration coming into office in Washington. What are your views on what is happening in Syria, and where do you think things could go?
Well, of course, we have seen a long civil war building up to this point. We've also seen that Turkey has been constantly behind this civil war as the dominant sponsor and actor of the anti-Assad movement. So it's Turkey to which we should be looking now, and President Erdogan of Turkey. This is if you like, his last-ditch attempt to change the map before President Donald Trump comes into office. So now President Trump, when he comes into office on January the 20th, will have to deal with the fait accompli, the fact that Syria is now an open battleground. It's not to the advantage of the United States. It's not to the advantage of Israel. It's not to the advantage of Iran or to Russia. So the only player who gains benefit from this really is President Erdogan of Turkey. So that's going to be the interesting game set we've got now. Interestingly enough, President Erdogan has been preparing to go to war with Israel for some time, particularly over the past year. He has been moving his strategic forces, his combat aircraft, aerial refueling aircraft and the like, down into fields in areas in the south of Turkey so that he can position to fight Israel. And to do that, he's taken his assets away from fighting a war against Greece. So that's very interesting. He knows that this is his existential battle, which will either keep him in office or finish him off. It's his one chance, if you like, to reestablish credibility for a new Ottoman Empire. So make no mistake, Turkey is the driver of this. It may be that there are other players who have aided and abetted in this indirectly, including the United States, who supported a lot of these Syrian opposition forces over the years. But the ultimate victim at this particular point is going to be Israel. Until this point, Israel has been able to handily dominate the region. The war, which began on October the 7th last year, starting with Hamas and then with Hezbollah and then Iran directly, was all managed perfectly by Israel. But I believe Israel failed to pay attention to the reality that Turkey was making a move against it. We did report that Turkey was preparing its military to fight Israel, but basically the belief was that it was on the basis that Erdogan feared that Israel would come and strike Turkey, rather than the other way around. So what we've got now is, if you like, the true dimension of the Turkish position coming into clarity. They were preparing to clear the field between Turkey and Israel. There's nothing now between Turkey and Israel, in a sense, other than Syria. And if Turkey controls the Syrian opposition groups, at least the majority of them, to take power, then Turkey is in a direct confrontation with Israel.
Why didn't Russia and Iran do something to protect Assad?
That's the big question. They were obviously both rather distracted, as was Israel. But Israel has had a history of this being led into following the wrong leads on some of these things. It did so in 1973 and 1982, 1983, for example. So we've got 73 rather. We've got these examples before where Israel has let some major things slip. It gets the tactical stuff right, but sometimes misses the intent. The same applies to the United States. The US should have seen this as well. Russia was aware that over the past year that Assad was weakening, and Russia didn't have a lot of resources to put into Syria at this particular time. But I think this is something which could have been avoided. However, the Syrian government under President Assad has been becoming increasingly unpopular. And we even see that a lot of his own Alawite people, which is a minority, he's an Alawite, were basically fed up with him. The state of the country wasn't getting any better. Israel was happy to see him stay there because under the Assads, both Bashar and his father, Hafez, they had a stable situation where Syria was not about to really rock the boat and start a war with Israel, another war with Israel, knowing how much they'd lost previously, including the Golan Heights, which was critical to Syria and is now critical to Israel. But Syria still was not about to go to war over that again, and wasn't about to do anything other than to aid and abet the Iranians moving through the Syrian landscape to deliver supplies into Lebanon so that Iran maintained a corridor from Iran to the Mediterranean, something which it has always striven to do for the past 3,000 years.
There was a report in Sydney, a number of reports in Sydney, of celebrations among the people from Syria and Sydney who live in Sydney, and they were chanting something, and it was in Arabic, and translations were called for, and the translation was broadcast on 2GB, and that was that they were chanting "Death to the Jews." And the question was asked, well, why on earth would they be chanting that in relation to the overthrow of Assad?
Yes, a difficult one, that, for two reasons. Firstly, that the Israelis were not behind the attack on Assad this time. They have been an historical enemy, and they've always been a scapegoat for the Assad government, blaming them. But the reality is that under Assad and the Alawites, but even historically, the government or the leaders in Damascus have protected the Fertile Crescent of minorities, which sweeps across northern Syria over toward Iraq and Iran, and of course on the Turkish border. And that's Fertile Crescent of minorities included not only the Kurds, but the big Jewish community of Syrian Jews, as well as others, Druze and the like. So basically, there's the government of Syria, whether it's Ba'athist or earlier, have been fairly protective of the minorities and against the xenophobia, for example, of the Turks when they became excessively militant under Erdogan, because he's an extremist Sunni Muslim who basically was hostile to the Shia as well as to others. I mean, he's hostile to the Shia because the Iranians are dominated by the Shia, and so that's never been a popular audience for him. But now we also need to look at another player in this, which is Saudi Arabia, and we need to watch what Saudi Arabia does going forward. Saudi Arabia has in the past attempted to push its own nominees for leadership in Syria's neighbor, Lebanon. And the Hariri family, for example, were largely regarded as loyal Sunnis who were cooperating with the government of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And whether they have a hand in this, I doubt, but it's quite possible that they did. It's quite possible that they did so in coordination also with Turkey.
Do you expect that President Trump will try to revive his policy of encouraging the Abraham Accords, the treaties between Israel and Arab countries? And I assume all of them have they with Sunni Arab countries? That would be right, would it not?
Well, yes. I mean, you've still got, like, for example, Bahrain, which is led by a Sunni king, but the majority of the population there is Shia. And of course, similarly in Iraq. But under the Abraham Accords, most of the countries with which he's been dealing have been Sunni, and of course the various factions of the Sunnis as well, and not all of the Wahhabist variety like Saudi Arabia and Qatar. For example, the US, even before the Trump Abraham Accords, was very, very supportive with Oman, which is peopled by Ibadi Muslims who are far more moderate than and sit between, if you like, the Shia and Sunni religious factions. But there's no question that President Trump, when he comes into office, is going to solidify, dampen down, or put it this way, cement into place the Abraham Accords as they stood when he left office the last time. And he is ready with Saudi Arabia to bring Saudi Arabia into those accords. Saudi Arabia has expressed an interest in that, is already having widespread cooperation with Israel. However, as things get messy in the region, it may be that a lot of the Arab countries will not want to put this on the front burner of public attention, as long as they will continue to cooperate with Israel and the United States, and perhaps, I would think, increasingly now that President Biden is leaving, because there's no question that most of the Arab states do trust the United States under Trump, but not under Biden, not under Obama. President Trump also managed to help cement things with Morocco, for example, over the question of the former Spanish Sahara, which is now firmly and legally in the hands of the Kingdom of Morocco. But that was at the expense of US relationships with Algeria. But then again, Algeria has traditionally been supported by and supportive of the Soviet Union and now Russia. So all of these things are evolving, and there's no clean edges anywhere in this, except for the fact that we know that Turkey is really throwing out a challenge now to Israel. And this is at a time when Turkey has run out of cash, which is why Turkey is trying to get into such things as the Eastern Mediterranean pipeline, which Israel, Cyprus, Greece, and Egypt essentially control to get their natural gas out of their offshore gas reserves over to markets in Greece and then in Italy and then into mainstream Europe. So Turkey wants to buy into that by force or diplomacy, but they know that diplomacy hasn't worked well with them so far.
Where does this place Turkey's belonging to NATO?
Well, it's a joke. Turkey has never ever been a loyal member of NATO, but under Erdogan it has been particularly transactional. It's used its membership in NATO as a bargaining chip. When Erdogan has wanted to get something from the West, whether it's Europe and the European Union or NATO as a whole or the United States, it's made a move to associate more closely with Moscow. So the West has generally given in and helped us, Erdogan, the European Union, particularly when Angela Merkel was Chancellor of Germany, provided vast amounts of cash to Turkey in an attempt to get Turkey to curb the flow of illegal migrants into Europe, a flow, by the way, which he inspired and generated. So he basically was running a protection racket there, and that's run out of steam as the Europeans have run out of money to pay him. So he's now looking for leverage. He can't afford to offend Moscow too much, and he can't afford to alienate Washington too much, but he will alienate both of them a bit at a time to get to balance. But that balancing act between the West and the East is becoming more and more difficult for Erdogan. Erdogan is running out of money. His country is bankrupt. The inflation rate is of Argentine proportions before President Milei took office there. So basically, Turkey is in bad shape economically. What we see is that although they have emerged as the principal supporter of Hamas and the other Muslim Brotherhood movements, its principal ally and funder, namely the Emirate of Qatar, has been pulling back its support and its financial investment in Turkey. And this was evidenced by the fact that Qatar is really trying to step up its relations once again with the West. We saw in the last week, we had the Emir of Qatar and his wife, his principal wife, made a state visit to London while I was there, actually. It was a spectacular event, and they were warmly received by King Charles there at that state visit. And once again, King Charles is showing that he's the ultimate diplomat for the West and is being able to negotiate friendships and improvements in diplomatic ties when the governments of the day could not. So, but Qatar, which, as I say, was Turkey's main sponsor, has now begun withdrawing its investments from Turkey. At the same time, Turkey is a big enough country to have a lot of momentum, and it has been pressing ahead with its own nuclear weapons program, which had until now been highly discouraged by the US and other NATO partners. But it's now Turkey is moving ahead with it because it knows that Iran, one of its other great rivals, is already equipped with nuclear weapons, both for aircraft use and for missile deployment.
And if I could take you away from the Middle East, but to another matter of interest to Australia, also in relation to the new American president, and that is the Five Eyes Agreement and the role of Canada. You make the interesting point, do you not, that Canada's expenditure on defence is lower than ours and lower than the expected 2% that all Western countries are supposed to commit in relation to supporting the relationship with the United States. What do you expect President Trump to be doing in relation to Canada? And with the coming Canadian election, do you expect changes in Canada?
Well, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has had a couple of meetings now with President-elect Trump, and basically has come out saying he feels pretty good about that. And there's no doubt that he's, before Mr. Trump becomes president once again, Justin Trudeau is definitely acting preemptively to get on his good side, and so are a lot of American politicians and the like. So, yes, there's going to be an impact there. Justin Trudeau will not be in office come the next elections in Canada. And depends on how quickly those elections occur. They could be as late as around September next year, because they have the numbers to hang on, because it's a minority government to begin with, but they're supported by some very small parties who will never withdraw their support from Trudeau's Liberal Party, simply because those minor parties will never ever get this close to being part of a government again. But when the elections occur, the polls are definitely showing that the Conservatives under the leader Poilievre is going to sweep into office with a good mandate to govern, and he will be very, very supportive of increasing defence. Trudeau has not resisted lately some of the moves by the Canadian defence establishment to begin rapidly upgrading its forces. They have belatedly ordered something like 88 F-35 fighters, which is a good number. They've committed to a major shipbuilding program, which is now turning out to be a debacle almost on the scale of the Australian nuclear submarine program, or any submarine program we seem to have tackled. So he's now, what we have now are people at the working level in the Ministry of National Defence in Canada and the armed forces talking to the Americans about an interim buy of some US Navy Arleigh Burke class destroyers or cruisers before they get the compatible frigate destroyer option, which the British, the Australians and the Canadians were due to get. So the Canadians may step up their defence commitment shortly. They'll have to do a number of things to balance their budget. They're going to have to go through a sweeping reform program, much the same as President-elect Trump is envisaging, to reduce waste in the Canadian government. But I've been speaking with a number of, I was in Canada 3 times in the past month or so, and speaking to a lot of senior people in the security side of the business, and it's very interesting. They were shocked into awakeness when AUKUS was announced in September, was it 2021? I think it was, or 2021. And they basically felt overwhelmed that they had never been told about the plan to create AUKUS. Now, at the time, we saw Prime Minister Trudeau saying, well, we didn't want to buy nuclear submarines anyway, which was beside the point, because AUKUS is not just about nuclear submarines, nuclear-powered submarines. And what we saw in a recent Five Eyes summit, and Five Eyes is basically the US, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, all on an equal footing, exchanging intelligence, raw intelligence and some finished intelligence. And that basically was the ultimate security pact in the world. And the envy, if you like, of a lot of other countries, the other NATO countries, apart from Britain and Canada, couldn't participate in it, for example. So when they had a Five Eyes meeting recently in Australia, the 3 members of the AUKUS bloc, US, UK, Australia, would often scurry out of the room into another room and have side meetings. And the Canadians objected to that, say, look, we're all equal partners in Five Eyes. This is a Five Eyes summit. We've paid for our share of it. You guys better start talking to us seriously. And what I know is that the Canadians are now at a, if you like, a sub-Trudeau level, preparing their position to have Canada join AUKUS. And I think that would be welcomed once Pierre Trudeau is out of the way. He's regarded by many as a security risk, even by the Canadians. So essentially, we could start to see an overlap between AUKUS and Five Eyes. And this may result in a sense of a total overlap, a merger of the 2 bodies, and with later developments into an operational pact which would coordinate not only the intelligence exchanges between the 5 countries and the transfer of strategic technologies without some of the recent political legal constraints. But it would also see probably a merging of things like the various aspects of the US-Canada operational defence arrangements, bringing ANZUS, Australia, New Zealand, US relationship into that, so that you have the capability between the five AUKUS countries, if you have Five Eyes countries and the AUKUS countries, if they're overlapping. This could be the greatest strategic security alliance in the world, but we have to sit down and rethink it. At this point, we've got all of the Five Eyes countries, and arguably all of the three AUKUS countries, being led by strategic incompetence. And it's only with the arrival of President Trump in January next year that we'll start to see this much more strategically oriented and professional approach to global security issues. And we will see, following that, of course, the change of government in Canada. We're now seeing a huge pressure to change the government, the unbelievably incompetent government in the United Kingdom, and certainly we're going to see changes at the next Australian elections in 2025 as well. New Zealand already has a Conservative government, but not a very strong one. We've already seen how weak and unprofessional the Defence Minister there has been over recent actions with the failures of the Royal New Zealand Navy and so on. But we're basically seeing the way things could go. But the first thing, all of the five states in Five Eyes and the three states in AUKUS need to do is really do some strategic planning, including goal setting, looking out at the world security situation after the collapse of the Chinese security threat, and moving into, if you like, the mid-21st century.
What is creating quite a stir in Australia at the moment is the move of the Australian government away from the support of Israel having a similar position to the United States, the move away from that, and a general belief internally that the law is not being applied fully in relation to anti-Semitic attacks in Australia. And there is a feeling among a number of Australians that we seem to be changing our position, both internally and externally, mainly to capture a number of Muslim votes in Sydney and Melbourne for the Australian Labor Party. And this is a matter of some concern in Australia. I don't suppose anybody has much noticed the change of our position in the United Nations.
Well, I've noticed it in the United States, that's for sure. The pictures of pro-Palestinian riots and demonstrations and the anti-war demonstrations in Melbourne recently at the Defence Summit down there, or Defence Exhibition down there, certainly got some attention in Washington. The reality is that the United States has been going through that too. But what we're seeing in Australia with the pro-Palestinian moves by some Islamist groups who have dragged in, if you like, a lot of the university coterie, if you like, these have been extreme minorities. These do not represent the general public, just as we've discovered that the radical left approaches in the United States in no way represented the majority of US voters, and the turnout at the last elections on November the 5th were profound in that regard. We saw a very, very conservative pro-Western and pro-Western values government get elected with a majority in both the House and the Senate, as well as the White House. So I think what we're seeing with these attempts by the Labor Party in Australia to court, shamelessly court, as we've seen with the case of the Foreign Minister as well as the Prime Minister, shamelessly court the Muslim vote. It's not going to get them votes, or certainly nothing significant. So it's not going to win them the election next year. I think that a lot of people will find that large numbers of the Muslim community, in any event, do not welcome this radical Islamist stance. A lot of them came to Australia to escape that sort of xenophobia. They want to live in a normal country with normal values and security. So the fact that you've got a few radicals stirring the pot is not really representative of the voting community.
I think, yes, I think on that you're absolutely correct. Once again, I must thank you so much for your contribution, and I look forward to continuing that if you have the time in the coming year.
We're certainly looking forward to that at this end as well. Thank you, David. Great to be with you.
Thank you.
I'm proud of what I fought for. I'm not going to back down from them one bit. I will answer all of these senators' questions, but this will not be a process tried in the media. I don't answer to anyone in this group, none of you, not to that camera at all. I answer to President Trump, who received 76 million votes on behalf and a mandate for change. I answer to the 100 senators who are part of this process and those in the committee, and I answer to my Lord and Savior and my wife and my family. I'm proud to be here, and as long as Donald Trump wants me in this fight, I'm going to be standing right here in this fight, fighting to bring our Pentagon back to what it needs to be.
Pete Hegseth is absolutely right. Why should he be answering vague media accusations from anonymous sources saying, for example, that he was seen drinking or smelt of drink when he was working at Fox? Well, why shouldn't he answer them? I think for two reasons. First, the mainstream media in the United States is still playing partisan politics. Trump won, and they still want to try and defeat him by blocking his choices for the cabinet. The second reason is they and his enemies fear him. They fear this appointment. As Delbert Bosworth writes, Hegseth promises to take what is being turned into a woke army governed by the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and return it to, if not only what it was, but what it must be if America is to remain a great power. It asks and answers, why are recruitment numbers plummeting? Why are those willing to fight for America being undermined by those sworn to protect its values? And most importantly, what does this mean for the future of the United States security and the West security? Can we still count on the warriors the United States needs to defend its homeland when its leaders are waging a war on them? This book by Hegseth is a wake-up call and a rallying cry for those who believe in a strong and unapologetic America. Trump won in a landslide. It's not for the rhinos, the Republicans in name only in the Senate, especially those who didn't have to face the electors this time, to undermine Donald Trump. I'm delighted to have a very distinguished guest on this occasion, Dr. David Adler, the president of the Australian Jewish Association and former Deputy Secretary to the Australian Medical Association. Welcome, Dr. Adler.
Thank you, Professor David Flint, and it's always a privilege to join you for a discussion.
Well, thank you. I must say that I'm not ashamed to be an Australian, but I am very disappointed about the situation as it now seems to me in Australia. We have our foreign policy being determined, according to a prominent member of the Labor Party, by asking to what extent can this policy be defended from the steps of the Lakemba Mosque. And then we have the situation in the states. And for this I blame the state governments, the state premiers, for allowing this to happen, in which we have seen, since those dreadful events in October 2 years ago in Israel, where we had this shocking invasion of Israel by Hamas, where unspeakable butcheries were committed. And we had that demonstration which followed outside on the Opera House, where the government of New South Wales, the police in New South Wales, shepherded the mob to the Opera House, tolerated a riot which was not followed by any police action. And that seems to me to be replicated constantly in Australia, where the rule of law is not being applied, the law is not being enforced. And what happened at the Opera House was obviously a breach of the law. All that fuss about whether the new section would or wouldn't work is complete rubbish. And I was shocked by that. And then you had the police spending much of their time by engaging in some specialist who came to the ridiculous conclusion that what was being chanted, the disgusting chant of "Gas the Jews," was actually "Where's the Jews?" which is not even idiomatic and certainly wasn't what everybody heard at the time. I find this absolutely appalling, and I blame I blame the federal government, the Albanese government, the way in which they've behaved in the United Nations, the way they've changed traditional policy. But I also blame Mr. Minns, who seems to be a very good man and speaks well about these issues. But somebody in New South Wales has told the New South Wales police not to fully enforce the law as they would in relation to anybody else, and a similar thing is happening in Victoria. I find the situation appalling. I know in some instances you can't speak in some areas, but I'd be delighted to hear your views on how you regard the situation in Australia at the moment.
Well, there's quite a lot in that introduction, Professor Flint, and I'm certainly not ashamed to be an Australian. We've had a lot of people tell us, we love Australia, but we are ashamed of the Australian government. They draw that distinction. And certainly the behaviour of the current federal government has been extremist. It's been the most hostile ever to Israel, to the only democratic ally in the Middle East. And many of the policies that it's introduced downstream from that has caused enormous trauma to the Jewish community in Australia. And you're quite right to highlight the events of October 9 at the Opera House. And I'd like to remind people that the actual terrorism, the invasion of Israel by Hamas, thousands of terrorists, and the barbarity that was undertaken was 7 October. So we're talking 2 days later, when Israel hadn't even responded. It wasn't possible to protest any responsive actions by Israel because there weren't any. And so when they started the various chants that were anti-Semitic, there's no dispute that F the Jews was said. There was no dispute that there were calls for an intifada, which is a violent uprising. There is a dispute of where's the Jews versus gas the Jews. And I guess it's possible both words were said. We do have statutory declarations from people who heard gas the Jews. And the question which remains completely unanswered, at least not satisfactorily, is why the law was not enforced on the 9th of October, because it set the tone for the subsequent 15 months. Now, I know from a security expert that there is high-resolution CCTV monitoring all around the Opera House. If the government was of a mind, they could instruct that facial recognition technology be applied to that CCTV. They could identify the people who let off flares, who burnt flags, who shouted this incitement repeatedly. And we think that there was already terrorist flags being displayed, in particular a flag of Hezbollah. And because there was no effective law enforcement except for a couple of Jews that turned up and they were arrested or moved on, those thugs who are pushing the boundaries of violence have been emboldened, and we've seen more and more and more. And of course, just in the last week or so, the firebombing of a synagogue follows protests in Melbourne, follows protests against the Great Synagogue in Sydney, follows on from the vandalism of cars in Wallara, the encampments on the universities. This is not the Australia we want. And at the end of the day, it is our political leaders who must bear responsibility. And I got a call earlier in the day, I'll share with you, from a Vietnam veteran. And he said to me, I fought for this country, but I didn't fight for the anti-Semitism on the streets. I didn't fight for the mobs. I fought for our democratic values. And all his veteran mates won't be voting for the current government in the next election, according to what he told me. So we hang on to the hope that there is a silent majority out there of good, reasonable Aussies who, in a few months' time, will express their judgment via the ballot box, and hopefully they'll make a wise decision.
What I found extraordinary among the many statements of the foreign minister, Ms. Wong, was that she said that we pay respect to the neutrality, I suppose, or whatever words she used, of the International Criminal Court. As you know, the International Criminal Court has shown how biased it is, just in the very people it chose for the chamber to decide on the warrants for the arrest of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Defence Minister. And I am surprised to the extent to which the federal government has changed what was very much a bipartisan foreign policy in relation to the only democracy in the Middle East, as we know, and our ally, Israel. And I find this extraordinary that the government would go ahead and change foreign policy on the basis of advantage, apparent advantage in relation to the next election.
Well, the International Criminal Court, as many people know, is actually an arm of the United Nations. It's not independent. It has political appointments to it, and its role, established shortly after the Holocaust, was to have a sort of a fallback legal system in the event that a country did not have a functioning legal system. And Israel has a very robust legal system. And senior politicians have been tried, have been convicted by courts. There is no question that should there be any inappropriate conduct, as a functioning democracy with separation of powers, it can be dealt with internally. An interesting observation as we look also in that area, Syria it looks like the Assad regime has fallen and that Assad has fled. Some would say he is responsible for well over 500,000 deaths, torture prisons, chemical weapon use, potentially some of the worst crimes against humanity. The ICC has not issued any warrant against him, nor against many other prominent people in the world who have committed the most heinous crimes. So again, we have this outrage, I think, that the foreign policy for Australia seems to be shifting, either driven by extreme left ideology, because the current Labor government is not like previous Labor governments of Hawke, Keating, even Gillard and Rudd. This is a much more left-wing, much more radical government. So perhaps it's extremist ideology, and perhaps it's looking at internal electoral priorities. And if you do the numbers, it's a no contest. We have a little over 100,000 Jewish people in Australia. We have a bit over 800,000 Muslims, many of whom would have a very dim view about the state of Israel. And if you're a backroom numbers cruncher for political purposes, that is, it's not a great loss to throw the Jewish people under a bus, to throw Israel under a bus, so to speak. It's undemocratic. It's not in Australia's national interest, but if you're looking at your domestic political electoral priorities, it makes sense. So we think Penny Wong is being driven both by ideological extremism and wanting to be returning for another term as Foreign Minister, where the journey that she's on can be continued.
Only about 15% of the world constitute countries which live under the rule of law, which are functioning democracies. And it seems to me to be somewhat ridiculous that we would put the fate of Australia in the hands of any organisation which is dominated by about 85% of countries which are corrupt dictatorships and so on. The unfortunate people are ruled by these. And it seems very silly, for example, for Australia to ever joined the International Criminal Court. I remember at the time there was a great division within the Liberal Party. Alexander Downer recently revealed that apparently he was in favour and John Howard was against. The cabinet was almost equally divided. They took it to the party and there was a slight preference for joining, and they made the mistake of joining. I think most people now would say we should pull out of the International Criminal Court. One of the things that Ms. Wong has agreed to, and the government has agreed to at the United Nations, is a resolution which includes the premise that Israel has an unlawful presence in the occupied territories, an unlawful presence in the occupied territories. Well, that seems to be an extraordinary statement, that that presence of Israel there. They're talking about Judea and Samaria, the area of that part of the world, which was part of the British mandate, was it not? The British mandate of Palestine. So how could the successor state have an unlawful presence in those occupied territories, as they say?
Well, you have a historical knowledge that perhaps Penny Wong does not. It was indeed part of the British mandate, which was established in the 1920s, and the purpose of the mandate was to restore the Jewish homeland, and it was confirmed by the then League of Nations and subsequently by the United Nations. But it's more than just Judea-Samaria. The definition, according to DFAT, our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, includes Gaza, includes the Golan Heights, includes the old city of Jerusalem. So what this resolution is in effect saying is that the old city of Jerusalem, with the Jewish quarter, with the Temple Mount, where Solomon's temple stood, having a Jewish presence there is somehow wrong. It's a nonsense. It's not only contrary to religious principles, it's contrary to history. We believe it's contrary to international law, as do many legal experts, and there have been video documentaries produced which demonstrate that. There has been no other entity which has had Jerusalem as its capital other than the ancient Israel and now the modern Israel. There has never been a sovereign Palestinian state. There is no actual sovereign claim. Jordan no longer claims it. They occupied Judea Samaria for a while. There is no sovereign entity that has a claim other than Israel. And for peace purposes, offers have been made to the Arab-Palestinian leadership. And very interestingly, former US President Bill Clinton has recently, on speaking circuits, explained the generosity of the offers that were made to establish a state of Palestine, and they were constantly rejected. The truth is nowadays, nobody in the Middle East, or hardly anybody in the Middle East, wants such a thing. For quite different reason. The Jews don't want it because they see the potential for a giant Gaza, a terrorist entity.
Exactly.
Yeah, and the radicalised Arabs don't want it because they frankly want Israel eliminated. They don't want to live side by side with a Jewish state. So it has zero chance at the moment of proceeding. And then one last point, David, which is worth making. This goes way further. Australia is way more radical now in its foreign policy than even the Biden-Harris administration. America did not support these radical resolutions. And of course, with the Trump administration taking over on the 20th of January, Australia is not just distancing itself in foreign policy from Israel, it's distancing itself significantly from our largest and most important ally, the United States of America.
I think that's a very important point, and you also pointed out, and I had missed the point, that what Ms. Wong is saying to Israel is, you are unlawfully present in your capital, which is so ridiculous. But just finally, what do you expect from the presidency of Donald Trump? This will make a very big change, won't it, in the attitude of the West and in relation to the support which he will give, no doubt, to Israel?
100%. And you can look at his track record when he was president previously, and perhaps the glowing achievement was the Abraham Accords, the establishment of normalisation arrangements between Israel and 4 Arab countries in the area, an achievement that for decades no one else had been able to deliver. And some of the people he's appointed already for the administration are outstanding. Mike Huckabee is going to be the American ambassador to Israel, and other appointments we think have said some outstanding things. If they're able to deliver the policies that they're articulating at the moment, there is a good chance that the conflicts can be dissipated, and hopefully the Abraham Accords can be re-established and widened, and who knows, maybe even Saudi Arabia would join, which would be a bit of a game changer for the region.
Well, President Trump made much of the observation that when he survived the assassination, that many Americans saw this as the hand of Providence. Well, perhaps in international affairs, his arrival may well be, in many ways, many people may well believe that this is the hand of Providence in relation to securing peace in the Middle East. And you were so right. And even when we know that when that attempt was made to have the Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia, that was probably the stimulus that caused Iran to encourage Hamas to that terrible, that uncivilized, that brutal, butchering invasion of Israel, which was such an outrage.
Yeah, well, we're holding on to the hope that Internationally, January 20 will be a bit of a turnaround, and Australia is due for an election sometime in the next few months. Some of the leaders in the current government have been outrageously bad, in our view, on foreign policy and in failure to deal with important domestic security issues, and of course the anti-Semitism. And who knows, Australia might see a turnaround within the next 6 months begin as well.
Let us hope so. Once again, Dr. Adler, thank you so much for your contribution, and thank you for fighting for these important principles.
And thank you, and let's hope we can save the nation.
Indeed, let's do that. You've been watching Save the Nation on ADH TV. I'm David Flint. My producers, and I must thank them for their hard work and their support and great assistance, are Charlie Noble and Domenica Fennell. And now, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and until next time and until next year.